On March 7, 1997, a Boeing 737-400 operated by Pacific Coastal Airways completed a routine domestic flight from San Diego International to Denver's Stapleton Replacement Facility. The aircraft landed without incident. The crew reported no abnormalities. Passengers disembarked normally. But when the flight data was cross-referenced 3 days later during a routine audit, investigators discovered something that should have been impossible. According to every synchronized clock system along the route, the flight had arrived 14 minutes before it departed. The morning of March 7th began unremarkably. Pacific Coastal Flight 619 was scheduled to depart San Diego at 6:22 a.m. local time, arriving in Denver at 9:47 a.m. Mountain Standard. The aircraft, registered November 739, Charlie Papa, had logged 41,000 flight hours since manufacture in 1991. It had undergone a C-check inspection 17 days prior. All systems were within normal parameters. The fuel load was calculated at 18,400 pounds, standard for the route with typical headwinds and a 40-minute reserve. Captain Raymond Melcher had 16,000 hours of commercial flight time. First Officer Linda Cow had 7,200 hours. Both had flown this route more than 100 times. There were 4 flight attendants and 136 passengers. The weather forecast showed clear skies across the entire corridor with light westerly winds at altitude. It was the kind of flight that generates no stories, no memories, no paperwork beyond the usual. The pushback occurred at 6:19 a.m. San Diego ground control cleared the aircraft to runway 27. First Officer Cow handled the radio. Captain Melcher ran the taxi checklist. At 6:22 and 30 seconds, Pacific Coastal 619 was cleared for takeoff. The aircraft rotated at 142 knots, climbed through the marine layer, and turned northeast toward the initial waypoint. Departure control handed them off to Los Angeles Center at 6:31 a.m. The crew checked in at flight level 210, climbing to their assigned cruise altitude of 37,000 feet. Everything was progressing exactly as filed. At 6:47 a.m., the aircraft leveled off. Autopilot engaged. The flight management system showed an estimated time en route of 2 hours and 19 minutes. Fuel flow was nominal. Outside air temperature was minus 58 degrees Celsius. The jet stream was positioned further north than usual, so the predicted headwinds never materialized. If anything, they had a slight tailwind component, maybe 15 knots. First Officer Cow noted this on the flight log. It meant they might arrive a few minutes early, which was normal and unremarkable. The first irregularity occurred at 7:11 a.m., but nobody noticed it at the time. Denver Center's radar tracking system recorded Pacific Coastal 619 passing through a standard waypoint designated Pueblo Junction at exactly 7:11:03 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. But according to the aircraft's own flight management computer, which timestamps every waypoint passage using GPS synchronized internal clocks, the same event occurred at 7:09:51 a.m., a difference of 1 minute and 12 seconds. Small timing discrepancies are not unusual. Radar systems refresh at intervals. Transponder signals can arrive offset by a second or two depending on processing delays. But both systems are designed to remain synchronized within margins measured in milliseconds, not minutes, and nobody was watching closely enough to catch it yet. At 7:34 a.m., First Officer Cow contacted Denver Approach. She reported the aircraft was descending out of flight level 370 in accordance with the arrival procedure. The controller acknowledged and instructed them to continue via the standard arrival routing. The exchange lasted 11 seconds. It was recorded and archived like every other radio transmission. The descent continued normally. The aircraft passed through 25,000 feet, then 18,000, then 12,000. The crew extended the speed brakes and began configuring for landing. Flaps to 5 degrees, landing gear down at 10 miles, flaps to 15, then 30. The runway was in sight. Wind was light and variable. Tower cleared them to land on runway 35 right. Pacific Coastal 617 touched down at 9:33 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, 14 minutes ahead of schedule. The passengers applauded lightly, as passengers sometimes do. The aircraft exited the runway, taxied to gate B-17, and shut down engines at 9:41 a.m. Captain Melcher signed the logbook. First Officer Cow completed the shutdown checklist. The flight attendants opened the doors. The ground crew connected the jet bridge. 136 people walked into the terminal and continued with their day. Nobody suspected anything was wrong. 3 days later, on March 10th, a scheduling analyst named Derek Voss was reconciling flight data for a fuel efficiency audit. Pacific Coastal Airways had been tracking consumption rates across its 737 fleet to identify aircraft that might benefit from engine optimization. Voss was pulling automated records from the airline's operations database, which aggregated data from multiple sources, including the flight management systems, air traffic control logs, and fueling records. He noticed that Pacific Coastal 617 on March 7th showed an actual flight time of 1 hour and 51 minutes, gate to gate. That was unusually fast, not impossible, but worth a second look. He opened the detailed timeline. Departure time from San Diego, recorded by the aircraft's ACARS system, 6:22:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That converts to 7:22:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Arrival time at the gate in Denver, recorded by the same ACARS system, 9:41 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The elapsed time came out correctly. 2 hours and 18 minutes, almost exactly as planned. But then he checked the air traffic control records. Denver Tower had recorded the landing at 9:33 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. That matched the flight's own log. But the ACARS departure message, sent automatically when the aircraft pushed back from the gate in San Diego, had been received by the Pacific Coastal Operations Server at 7:36 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. More than 2 hours after the scheduled departure, but only 1 hour and 57 minutes before landing. Voss assumed it was a database error. He opened the raw ATC radar files. Pacific Coastal 619 first appeared on Denver Center's radar at 7:11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The aircraft was already at 37,000 feet, 190 miles southwest of Denver, exactly where it should have been at that point in the flight. But according to San Diego Tower's logs, the takeoff clearance had been issued at 6:22 a.m. Pacific, which was 7:22 a.m. Mountain. That meant the aircraft had covered nearly 600 nautical miles in negative 11 minutes. He ran the timestamps again. Then he called his supervisor. By the afternoon of March 11th, the discrepancy had been escalated to Pacific Coastal's chief of flight operations. At first, the assumption was that the ACARS system had malfunctioned. ACARS messages are transmitted via VHF or satellite and can occasionally be delayed or corrupted. But when the engineering team reviewed the message logs, they found that every ACARS transmission from Pacific Coastal 619 that morning had been received in proper sequence, with no gaps, no corruption, and no delayed delivery. The departure message, the climb report, the cruise notification, the top of descent advisory, and the arrival message all appeared in order, each time stamped by both the aircraft and the ground station. The ground station timestamps were consistent with a departure at 7:22 a.m. Mountain Time. The air traffic control records were consistent with a departure at 7:22 a.m. Mountain Time. but the aircraft had been cleared for takeoff by San Diego Tower at 6:22 a.m. Pacific, which was also 7:22 a.m. Mountain. Everything pointed to a departure at 7:22 Mountain, except that Pacific Coastal 617 had been tracked continuously by radar beginning at 7:11 a.m. Mountain. It had been in the air for at least 11 minutes before it departed. The FAA was notified on March 12th. An investigator from the Flight Standards District Office reviewed the records and interviewed the crew. Captain Melcher and First Officer Cow both confirmed that the departure had been routine. They remembered pushing back slightly early, around 6:19 a.m. Pacific. They remembered the takeoff clearance. They remembered the handoff to departure control. They did not remember anything unusual. The investigator asked if there had been any interruption in communication, any period where they lost contact with air traffic control, any gaps in radar coverage. Melcher said no. The radios had worked perfectly. They had been in contact with controllers the entire flight. Cow confirmed. There had been no dead zones, no lost signals, nothing. The investigator asked about the flight management system. Had it displayed any error messages, any caution lights, any abnormal indications? Again, no. Everything had functioned normally. Melcher said the flight had been so uneventful that he barely remembered it. It was just another San Diego to Denver leg. Smooth air, no weather. A slightly early arrival because of better than expected winds. That was all. The investigator pulled the cockpit voice recorder. The CVR had a 30-minute loop, so it only contained the final half hour of the flight, but nothing in the recording suggested any awareness of a problem. The crew had conducted a normal approach briefing. They had discussed landing performance calculations. First Officer Cow had commented that they were arriving ahead of schedule. Her exact words, time stamped at 9:21 a.m. Mountain, were, "Looks like we're going to be about 10 minutes early." Captain Melcher had responded, "Yeah, nice tailwind today." There was no indication that they believed anything unusual had occurred. The flight data recorder was more comprehensive. It captured the entire flight from brake release to engine shutdown. The FDR recorded 748 parameters every second, including airspeed, altitude, heading, control inputs, engine performance, and GPS position. When the data was downloaded and analyzed, it showed a completely normal flight. Takeoff at 6:22:30 a.m. Pacific. Climb to 37,000 feet. Cruise, descent, landing at 9:33 a.m. Mountain. All the numbers were consistent with the cruise report and with the aircraft's expected performance. But the FDR also recorded GPS time. GPS time is derived from atomic clocks aboard satellites and is accurate to within nanoseconds. The GPS receiver on Pacific Coastal 617 recorded the takeoff event at 14:22:30 Coordinated Universal Time, which converts to 6:22:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. It recorded the landing event at 16:33 MNI Coordinated Universal Time, which converts to 9:33 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The elapsed time between those two GPS timestamps was 2 hours, 10 minutes, and 30 seconds. But the radar data showed the aircraft had been in flight for 2 hours and 22 minutes. 12 minutes were missing. The FAA investigator requested a second analysis. The National Transportation Safety Board was briefed. On March 18th, a team of engineers from the NTSB and the FAA met at Pacific Coastal's maintenance facility in Phoenix to examine the aircraft. November 7, 3/9. Charlie Papa was pulled into a hangar. The flight management computer was removed and sent to a lab. The GPS receiver was tested. The ACAR system was inspected. The transponder was bench-checked. The inertial reference units were downloaded and analyzed. Everything worked perfectly. The flight management computer's internal clock was synchronized with GPS. The event log showed no resets, no power interruptions, no anomalies of any kind. The GPS receiver had maintained satellite lock throughout the flight. The ACAR system had transmitted and received messages without error. The transponder had broadcast the aircraft's position and altitude continuously. There was no evidence of malfunction in any system. On March 22nd, the investigators interviewed the air traffic controllers who had handled Pacific Coastal 619. The San Diego Tower controller, who had issued the takeoff clearance, remembered the flight vaguely, but he had handled 43 departures that morning and had no specific recollection of anything unusual. The departure control supervisor reviewed the radar recordings and confirmed that the aircraft had been tracked normally from departure through handoff to Los Angeles Center. The Los Angeles Center controller, who had taken the handoff, also remembered nothing unusual. The aircraft had checked in, climbed to its assigned altitude, and proceeded on course. The Denver Center controller, who had handled the arrival, said the same. The flight had been routine in every respect. But when the investigators compared the radar tracks from all three facilities, they found the discrepancy again. Los Angeles Center's radar had first painted Pacific Coastal 619 at 6:31 a.m. Pacific, exactly as expected based on a 6:22 a.m. departure. But Denver Center's radar had first acquired the aircraft at 7:11 a.m. Mountain, which was 6:11 a.m. Pacific. The aircraft had appeared on Denver's radar 20 minutes before it appeared on Los Angeles Center's radar, despite being 800 miles closer to Los Angeles at the time. That should have been impossible. Radar coverage areas overlap. The two systems should have tracked the same target at the same time, but the timestamps didn't align. One of the investigators suggested the radar systems themselves might have had a timing error. Radar sites use GPS-disciplined oscillators to maintain accurate time, but if a site's GPS receiver had lost lock or experienced a glitch, the timestamps could drift. The team contacted the FAA's Radar Maintenance Division and requested calibration logs for both facilities. The logs showed both sites had been operating normally. The GPS receivers had maintained lock. The timing accuracy had been within specification. There was no equipment malfunction that could explain a 20-minute error. On April 3rd, the NTSB issued an interim report. The report summarized the known facts, acknowledged the timing inconsistencies, and noted that no safety issue had been identified. The aircraft had operated normally. The crew had performed appropriately. No regulations had been violated. The report concluded with a statement that further analysis was ongoing. Privately, the investigators had no idea what had happened. In May, a theory emerged. A senior engineer at Boeing, who had been briefed on the case, suggested that the discrepancy might be the result of a software error in the way different systems handle time zones and daylight saving adjustments. Commercial aviation systems use multiple time standards. GPS systems use coordinated universal time. Air traffic control systems sometimes use local time. Flight management computers can be set to display either. If one system had incorrectly applied a daylight saving offset, or if a database had stored a timestamp in the wrong time zone, it could create the appearance of a timing error. The theory was plausible. The investigators re-examined every timestamp in every system. They checked the time zone settings in the flight management computer. They verified the UTC offsets in the ATC databases. They cross-referenced the ACAR's message logs with the ground station clocks. They traced every conversion and every calculation. They found no errors. On June 19th, a meteorologist from the National Weather Service was asked to review the weather data along the flight path. The request was informal, almost desperate. Someone suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions, perhaps related to jet stream dynamics or temperature inversions, might affect radio wave propagation in a way that could introduce timing errors in radar systems. The meteorologist analyzed upper air charts, satellite imagery, and weather balloon data from the morning of March 7th. He found nothing unusual. The atmosphere had been stable. The jet stream had been positioned normally. There were no fronts, no turbulence, no anomalies of any kind. In August, the investigation was quietly closed. The NTSB's final report, published on August 14, 1997, stated that the timing discrepancies were likely the result of a data synchronization error of unknown origin, possibly related to differences in how various systems log and transmit timestamps. The report noted that the aircraft had operated safely and that no similar incidents had been reported before or since. It recommended no changes to procedures or equipment. The case was filed as an unexplained anomaly and marked inactive. Captain Raymond Melcher retired from Pacific Coastal Airways in 2003. In a 2006 interview with an aviation safety journal, he was asked if he remembered the flight. He said he did, but only because of the investigation. He had no memory of anything unusual happening during the flight itself. He said it had felt like every other flight he'd ever flown. Normal weather, normal traffic, a normal arrival. He said the only strange thing was learning days later that according to the data, he'd landed before he'd taken off. He laughed when he said it, but the journalist noted that the laugh sounded uncertain. First Officer Linda Cow left commercial aviation in 1999 and became a flight instructor. She declined to be interviewed. Derek Voss, the analyst who first noticed the discrepancy, continued working for Pacific Coastal until the airline was acquired in 2001. In a private conversation years later, he said he'd gone back through the archives looking for similar cases. He found none. But he said he did find something else. He found that in the 3 days between the flight and the discovery of the timing error, the aircraft had flown 6 additional legs. All 6 flights had normal, consistent timestamps. Whatever had happened on March 7th had not repeated. It was isolated, singular. He said that bothered him more than if it had happened multiple times, because it meant there was no pattern, no explanation, no way to predict or prevent it. It had simply occurred once and then stopped. November 7th, 39, Charlie Papa continued flying for Pacific Coastal until 2002, when it was sold to a leasing company and re-registered in Ireland. It flew for 3 more airlines over the next decade. It was eventually retired in 2014 and scrapped at a facility in Arizona. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were removed before scrapping, as is standard, and stored in an FAA warehouse. They have never been re-examined. In 2011, a researcher at MIT who studies GPS accuracy and timing systems came across the NTSB report while reviewing historical cases of navigation anomalies. He contacted the FAA and requested access to the original radar data and flight recorder files. His request was denied on the grounds that the case was closed and the data was not relevant to active research. He submitted a Freedom of Information Act request. It took 14 months to process. When the files were finally released, several sections had been redacted, including portions of the ATC radar logs and the full GPS event timeline from the flight data recorder. The redactions were marked as exempt under provisions related to sensitive security information. The researcher found this unusual, since the flight had occurred in 1997 and involved no security incident. He appealed. The appeal was denied. In 2018, a documentary filmmaker attempted to investigate the case. She contacted former Pacific Coastal employees, reviewed public records, and submitted additional FOIA requests. She was able to confirm the basic facts. The flight had occurred, the timing discrepancies were real, and the investigation had found no explanation. But she was unable to obtain any additional data or interviews. Captain Melcher had passed away in 2015. First Officer Cow did not respond to repeated requests for comment. The FAA declined to provide anyone for an on-camera interview. The project was eventually abandoned. The passengers from Pacific Coastal Flight 617 were never contacted during the investigation. There was no reason to contact them. They had experienced a normal flight. They had arrived safely. They had no knowledge of any irregularity. Most of them probably never learned that anything unusual had been recorded. They went home, went to work, went about their lives. For them, March 7, 1997 was just another Friday. But somewhere in an archive, the data remains. Radar tracks that don't align. Timestamps that contradict each other. A flight that was recorded arriving 14 minutes before it departed, and yet every person aboard remembered a routine 2-hour trip across the southwestern United States. No crashes, no disappearances, no missing time, just a gap in the numbers that nobody can explain and that, officially, no longer matters. The question is not what happened. The question is whether it mattered that nobody noticed until 3 days later, and whether it would matter if it happened again and nobody noticed at all. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.